I am thrilled to invite you to be part of our Femme Future Society conversation series, Riane Eisler. I am thrilled that you are here. This whole thing was started so that we would be able to tap into the thinking and to the work of a body of big thinkers around the world. And some are younger, some are older, some are working on this portion of the future, and some are the others. But I think it's really fascinating to go back and think about your work and your body of work over a course of time, because you have really been steering us to the future we have now and preparing us, hopefully, for the shifts and the changes that we will continue to nourish and advance and hopefully accelerate as we move forward. So thank you for all the work you've done so far and for introducing us to the focus of your work currently. So, in the simplest form, described as a social systems scientist. Do you want to add to that background?
I just want to thank you and to tell you that it's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm so drawn to your work because, as you have seen, Riane and I have had a chance to work together a bit, or I've had a chance to support Riane's work, to be more fair. And as I'm so drawn to it because I realized it is so aligned with the things that I have been thinking about and advocating for, but not always having names for or such structured thinking around. So I think that there is this pull to the way that you have been framing and thinking about things that many of us are resonating with and being drawn to. So I'm glad that we get to introduce this hopefully to a broader group of people, although I know your work is really well known against many, but I don't know if they see the full connections between all the pieces of what you've done. So as we usually start these interviews, we do a bit of a how'd you get here trip, but again, your work is so vast. So I was asking you earlier if you see this in chapters or if you just see this as this long, continuous, necessary step for the next portion of the conversation. Like, have you just been drawn by the work that needs to be done?
Well, really, my life and my work, to some extent, are like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And what I've brought to this is not only connecting the various pieces, but making visible pieces that have been neglected. And I guess I should really back up a little bit, because when you say, how do I think of my work? Do I think of it as chapters, or do I think of it? My life has consisted in some ways of various chapters. And as my awareness has changed, so has my research and my writing and my keynoting and my activism. So perhaps I should start early on with my childhood, really, because my passion for this work, and yes, I have a great deal of passion for this work, it is deeply rooted in my childhood as a child refugee from Nazi Europe. And my parents and I, we really escaped by a hair's breadth. I won't go into the details. I write about them in my books sometimes, in articles, but as I said, we managed to escape by a miracle, really. And I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where after experiencing the cruelty and violence of, well, from one day to the next, my parents and I, we became hunted with license to kill. After that, I also observed and experienced another injustice, the terrible poverty, not only that we were thrown into until my parents got on their feet, but all around me, and the enormous disparities between those on top, the haves and the have-nots. And all of these experiences led me to questions that I think most of us have asked at some point in our lives. Does it have to be this way? When we humans have such an enormous capacity for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, why has there been so much insensitivity, cruelty, destructiveness? And fast forward quite a bit, my research is really designed to answer that question, and especially the question of what is the alternative, and is there one? And my research shows that the answer is a resounding yes. There is an alternative, but we cannot even see it through the lenses of our conventional worldview, especially through the lenses of the studies of society that we've been taught about what is important or not important or just simply ignored, and also through the conventional social categories such as right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western. Because if you really think about it, there have been unjust, violent, oppressive regimes in every one of these conventional categories, whether it's capitalism and socialism, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, and so on. Moreover, and this is really brings me back to what I said earlier about including important pieces of the system. These social categories, like conventional studies of society, either marginalize or actually ignore the majority of humanity, women and children.
So
And once
can I just
once you bring that in, you see something else.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, so I think that the part that I think is so fascinating is when you start to see the pieces that are missing. Because I think, yes, people have asked that question before, Riane. Not as many people have asked that question as should have, which is why did we get here and how is this working? But when you have really done your research and peeled it back, do you think that that is a piece that people have paid, even, like, have understood how we got here? Right, because your book, The Chalice and the Blade, which was so well received, and when I told you I listened to it in my car, I was like throwing things at my speakers, because you don't realize how manipulative the system has been over 4,000 years to get here. So I assume that that is work that's been out there, but that people have just not paid attention to. Have people just not been ready to hear this? Like, what do you think the biggest gap has been in people's ability to?
Well, we have all been socialized. Look at our stories about human nature. Whether it's original sin or selfish genes, it's the same story, isn't it? We're bad inherently as humans, and so we have to be rigidly controlled from the top. Perfect story for maintaining domination, lack of consciousness of alternatives. So people who are brought up, I mean, let me back up again a little, because my work really uh, identifies the core components of two social configurations that we find throughout human cultural evolution, cross-culturally as well as historically and prehistorically. And there were no names for these, and they transcend the conventional categories. I called one the domination system and the other one the partnership system, and really introduced what I've called the partnership domination social scale. And if you look at society from that perspective, a lot of that simply seems random, and disconnected begins to make sense.
For me, it was, again, really eye-opening when you mentioned that both capitalism and socialism and this tug of war that we continue to have between them. And I even watch my children that are in their early 20s try and make sense of this and trying to understand these systems and trying to figure out how to use those labels correctly, and identifying what it is that they're drawn to or not drawn to, don't realize that they were both framed through this domination system lens. And when you see that,
Absolutely.
when that awareness became clear to me through your work, it really does shift things quite dramatically.
Well, it's really interesting. As you said, we have been so conditioned to think that these are our only alternatives, forgetting, for one thing, that both capitalism and socialism came out of very early industrial times in the 1700s and 1800s, and we're now in the 21st century post-industrial era. So on that count alone, right, they would be antiquated. But as you said, the problem goes deeper, because both came out of times when this orientation to the domination side of the social scale, even in the West, was much stronger. And so both Smith and Marx crafted these theories with certain assumptions. And strangely, I mean, if you back off a little, you see that both the these theories, both these systems, actually leave out the three life-sustaining economic sectors and their contributions. I mean, we've talked about this, the natural economy, uh, the volunteer community creative economy, and the household economy. For them, and as this is still taught in our economics universities and schools, that was just reproductive, not productive. And again, if you look, for example, at GDP, that it reflects this domination thinking. And GDP is really crazy, as you know, it includes activities that harm and take life, like selling cigarettes, the resulting medical costs, the resulting funeral costs. They're all great for GDP. Oil spills, wonderful for GDP.
Rising childcare costs, great for GDP.
Yeah, but they fail to include the work of the contributions really from these three sectors. They talk of damage to nature as externalities. They consider the people who work from dawn to dusk caring for children in households as economically inactive. That's how economists are taught to think. So what we're really talking about is changing how we regard this work. And yes, digging deeper, we have to understand that there is here a gendered system of values reflecting this model of our species where one form of humanity, the male form, is considered superior to the other form. And, I mean, of course, it's a continuum, but to the female form. So you also have the definition in domination systems of real masculinity as not being like a woman. And of course, what's relegated to the soft, to the feminine, caring, caregiving, nonviolence. So no wonder we're in the mess we're in.
Yeah, I will say there are rays of hope, and again, I'm sure this has emanated from your work. But I was on a call earlier today with a company that I'm doing a keynote talk for their global management team around the world. It's a food company, small food company, but well, I guess 4 billion in revenue. Not tiny food company, actually relatively decent, but a private one. And I'm talking to the CEO, and he kept using the word caring. He used it a lot in how he feels about his employees, how he feels about his customers. I don't think he doesn't get it quite out as wide as we will encourage him to do. But it was encouraging to hear a male, white, over 50 CEO of a $4 billion company use that word so liberally in his discussion about the center point of his work. So I do think
Well,
it's hope.
it's and yes, I think that uh, the subtitle of my book, as you know, on this new economics, the caring economics of partnerism, um, is creating a caring economics. And I chose it deliberately because people said, well, don't use caring because, people will be turned off. But the whole point is to show the value. And yes, even the economic value of care work, especially visible now in terms of success in our post-industrial knowledge service age, when we keep hearing about having this, quote, high quality human capital, flexible, creative people, when we know from neuroscience, really, and that takes me to my most recent book, uh, as you know, Nurturing Our Humanity, which is right there behind you, as it came out with Oxford University Press just last year. We know that whether or not we get these creative, flexible, resilient people, etc., largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive early on. That our
So,
very brains really develop in childhood. And
so
it's very different, if I may say that, depending on the degree of orientation to either end of the partnership domination scale.
There are so many vectors that I want to go to as we have this conversation. I want to dive more deeply into the GDP things. I will say again, years ago, I was invited to a Chamber of Commerce end of year luncheon in Austin, and it featured 5 white male economists who all got up and gave their perspective on where the world was going. And every single one of them talked about GDP and job growth as the 2 metrics that were worth paying attention to. And I went crazy because I kept thinking this isn't it. And if we keep measuring toward that or orienting toward that, we're going to be in so much more trouble as we start looking at these technologies and these shifts in society that are not going to be aligned with that. So when I talk about, but the people don't know or don't think about the fact that I didn't know, like, how do we create an alternative to GDP? Like, I knew it was the wrong yardstick, but I couldn't figure out how to frame what was missing in it. And so when you talk about all the things that are in it that are dangerous and we're cheering on the growth of it, and we're also thinking about all the things that are missing, right? I bought a used electric car and that doesn't show up as a big win in GDP. How do you frame the alternative? Like, how do you describe what's possible?
Well, I think that the good news is how many, quote, GDP alternatives are beginning to be out there, all the way from the Bhutan happiness reports to all kinds of things. We at the Center for Partnership Systems have developed our own version of an alternative, and it really encompasses a lot of what is in other, but it is very different for a number of reasons. Its main purpose really is to show the economic value, the economic contribution of caring for people starting at birth and caring for nature, which really is not visible in the alternatives that focus on quality of life. The Bhutan Index, with all due respect, I mean, it's terribly subjective. You know, slaves can say they're happy. And yeah, I mean, because we humans really have that capacity. So in terms of how do we change allocation of resources by showing the economic effectiveness of investing in caring for people starting at birth and caring for nature. So when we first launched this approach with the social wealth economic indicators in 2014, we saw that, not coincidentally, the United States has the highest child poverty rate, the highest infant mortality rate, the highest maternal mortality rate by far, by the way.
Of developed nations, like of what set, because not around the entire world, right?
No, of any developed nation. And not coincidentally, it invests less than half of what other OECD nations, you know, developed nations, invest in family support, in caring for people, in caring for nature. We have to connect the dots.
Yeah, the fact that we don't have parental leave, the fact that
it's crazy.
It just, I'm the only one, I think, of all the 41 nations that are part of that collective, that we're the only ones.
We're the only one without paid parental leave, government sponsored, and really it is the best investment.
Well, you're about to say government sponsored childcare. Is that what you're about to say? Government sponsored?
Yes, is government sponsored, high waged, highly trained, well paid. And yes, parenting education. We know that the old, why, for example, whether it was Hitler in Nazi Germany or Khomeini in Iran or Stalin in the former Soviet Union or the Taliban or ISIS or the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the US, why do they always want to push us back or maintain a so-called traditional family, which isn't really traditional if you consider the whole span of our cultural evolution, but it is a code, isn't it, for an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family as the foundation on which domination systems rebuild themselves in regression after regression in modern times. So it's time that we started to think in systems terms.
So here are the things that have given me hope again along this work, right? When we realized that both capitalism and socialism are built on a domination system and that there's an alternative, whether you call it partnership systems or what we're calling partnerism, whether you think that there's an alternative to GDP and whether it's the social wealth economic indicators or social wealth, index, which is I think what we're working toward, right?
What
Trying
we're
to
working
all that up
toward
into
is,
one
yeah, to
number. But then also to think about that there are these stories from way back in the past because we aren't making this up. It isn't like we're just constantly evolving to this more, enlightened form of society and humanity. This did exist back in the day.
well, that is we have been told the false stories in so many areas, but especially in terms of, quote, human nature. Think of the caveman cartoon, right? You know, in one hand, he's got a club, a weapon. The other hand, he's dragging a woman by the hair. And we show this cartoon that basically says, hey, too bad, that's how it's always been, how it always will be, it's human nature, to children before their brains are developed, before their critical faculties even begin to make an appearance. Uh, that's a false story because my co-author, I worked on this book on nurturing our humanity for 7 years, and then I invited the anthropologist Douglas Fry to be my co-author. We worked on it for another 3 years. Uh, and one of the reasons I invited Doug is, among other things, he is probably one of the world's authorities on how we humans lived for millennia, millions of years, in foraging societies, which he calls the original partnership societies. They were not authoritarian, they were not male dominated, and as far as warfare goes, the evidence is really very clear now that war is at most 5 to 10,000 years old, which is a drop, a tiny drop in the bucket of cultural evolution. False story. It's up to us to change that story. And that's where a lot of the evidence, and where this new book, really sums up a lot of the evidence. But it already starts with Chalice, by the way.
I know. So I was going to say, so if you gave us I don't know what the short, for me, again, the short version of this, right, that there were societies in which men and women both were equal partners, had different roles, but were equally partners in it and held the same esteem, held the same amount of power. It was, and to your point, those were not, a Neanderthal. I mean, they were very sophisticated societies that were organized in very sophisticated ways. So this wasn't just because, they sort of fumbled their way into it. They organized in a way that flourished until we moved into nomadic societies. Is that what happened? We sort of became more
Well,
nomadic.
what happened, there are many theories as to why was there this shift, because obviously we're trying to reverse this shift.
Right.
The shift from a partnership orientation, not ideal, but less violent, more gender balanced, more equitable, to what we're trying to leave behind. And the theory that I find the most fascinating and convincing is that, at least in the area surrounding the Mediterranean, which is where most of the excavations, archaeological excavations, have taken place to date, the shift came with incursions from nomadic pastoralists who brought with them their top-down chieftain, male dominant, and warlike, very warlike. Um, and the thing that's so interesting is that this, again, is recent. I said warfare at most 5 to 10,000 years old. It really starts with these kinds of incursions. And in my book, Sacred Pleasure, which applies the partnership domination lens to sexuality and spirituality and everything else, by the way, sort of foreshadows a lot of my later work. I really discuss this in some detail as to why. Because I'm not an environmental determinist, I'm not a technological determinist. Just because something happened, it didn't have to happen.
Right. That's what I think is so interesting about your work is trying to figure out the stepping stones in understanding. And I think maybe less than stepping stones are just, to your point, puzzle pieces. Once you understand the gender history and the gender stories and the way in which they continue to be framed. I mean, again, as much as I went to women's college, I'm a self, directed person who makes her own money and runs her own life and whatever. And still, you don't realize how much we are under the gaze of those old stories and belief systems. Even trying to write a book, as you saw me struggling in the last year and a half trying to write this book, and telling myself, whether I have the authority to do so, and that it needs to be perfect, and these crazy stories that we still tell ourselves that are based on so much trying to prove ourselves over the course of time. In addition to the domination lens that goes on that, which I think is a really, really key part to understand the economic metrics that we put this forward. So if we switch gears for a moment and just sit there and say, we're about to head into a very contentious election in the United States. I think it's, 10 days or something away. And you imagine, what I guess I'm trying to figure out how you must witness this as someone who studied this for so long and thought we were hopefully evolving past this place where we would be so drawn to a dominator model, right? What is pulling people to
Well,
something?
not all of us are drawn to it, thank goodness.
No.
But, and this is really a cause for concern. Apparently, a substantial percentage of people in the United States are. And in Nurturing Our Humanity, we actually deal with studies of this phenomenon of why do people vote for, quote, strong man leaders who say they are going to fix it. But if you back up a little bit and you take into account that one of the core differences between partnership and domination systems is how these two cornerstones of childhood relations and gender relations are socially constructed, you see the answer. Because in domination systems, which are ultimately backed up by fear and force, you can talk about respect, but in domination systems, respect is really backed up by fear, isn't it? And caring, whatever caring you get, is mixed up with coercion. So people who grow up in these families, not everyone, thank goodness. Some people reject this. And I'd like to get back to that because it's very important. But many of them do not, and especially in what they learn is denial. They cannot express their pain, their anger, their rage really against those who cause them pain. Because these are highly punitive families, remember? So they learn to deflect it against out groups that are designated by an authority figure. But beyond that, even, strongman rule is familiar. It's a normative ideal.
Well,
So
on the most basic level, I feel like to some extent people climb to that because I think that it's paternalistic and safe. They think that somehow they will be protected in that.
that's right, that the very people who cause them pain are going to take care of them, which is true for them, was true in their childhood.
Mm.
I mean, think about when there is this confluence between caring and coercion.
Right.
You're
Got it.
going to vote for the strong man.
Right.
And studies have shown, there was a study that was done in 2016 that's fascinating, that people who tended to vote for Mr. Trump, they really subscribed to the old traditional, quote unquote, fear-based, violence-based parenting. There was another study that showed that one thing that these voters tended to have in common was very rigid gender stereotypes, and hence a fear and horror, really, about women who they consider uppity, who step
Including
out of that
women
thing.
have that fear of women.
Beg
My
your pardon?
colleague Emma, who you've met, just was watching Mrs. America. I haven't watched it yet. But interesting just to even see, as the women's rights movement was coming through, and Gloria Steinem and the rest so bravely were, trying to correct the imbalance that sits in our political system and social system, economic system. You had women fighting against it.
Well, of course, this is not a matter of women against men or men against women. Women have internalized the same value system, the devaluation of the feminine, and especially in men.
Right.
I mean, men are sissies, caring men. So all the men who are today diapering babies, feeding babies, they're not, quote, real men in the domination view. They're sissies, they're weak sisters. But I think you brought up a very important point. This has absolutely nothing to do with being born female or being born male. It's a question of how we're socialized, and we're right back to this gendered system of valuations. So if we look, for example, at nations that have today moved more to the partnership side, Northern European nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway, you find, first of all, that there is more gender balance, but there is also a more democratic and egalitarian structure in both the family and the state. And not coincidentally, these nations were in the forefront of trying to leave behind the third component of domination systems, which is built-in social violence. The first peace studies came out of Sweden. The first laws saying it's against the law to use physical discipline against children in families, and 50 nations have now followed it, a very important partnership trend, came out of these nations. This is not coincidental.
But it's
As
interesting, sorry to interrupt, but to see the narrative. So I was on the phone recently, I had a long conversation with a Harvard professor. We were talking about the future of work and some statistics around that. And he specifically pointed out those same countries as being ineffective. The systems didn't work. And he was so dismissive about it. Like, of course, that none of those things were actually very successful. And I'm thinking,
what?
actually, I think that's true.
Well, let me tell you that this man is telling you an untrue story.
Well, again, I don't think that he's an uncaring, awful person. I think that he's looking at it through a strange, distorted lens in which whatever
well, even through the conventional lens, these nations, he's just plain telling you a falsehood. And not because he's a terrible person, but because he's tunnel visioned.
right.
These nations are invariably in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. So when he says that it didn't work, he's lying.
I know. That wasn't the subject of our whole conversation, so I didn't take him off on that track to find out more about what gave him that belief, like why he was so short in his thinking around that. But I'm just saying, it's like, even when we can point to evidence that looks as clear as it looks to you and me, it is not fully translated across people who are thought leaders in this space and are advocating for change in other ways. So I just think there's a lot of work to be done in this.
There is a lot of work to be done. And yeah, for somebody like your acquaintance, the economist you mentioned, to consider that caring policies, investing in caring for people and caring for nature, actually brought these nations out of famine and out of dire poverty, and that raising the status of women, that 40 to 50% of the national legislature is female, because when that happens, when the status of women rises, men no longer see it, as he apparently still does, such a threat to their status, to their, quote, masculinity, to also embrace so-called soft, caring values. Again, not a question of women against men or men against women, really of the dynamics of partnership or domination systems. And I really want to add something very important. These nations are not socialists. They have, as I said, very healthy market economies. They also have caring government policies. And it's not because they're small and relatively homogeneous, because think about all the small, relatively homogeneous nations in our globe who are very domination oriented and do not have caring policies. It's simply because of the configuration, more closer to the partnership configuration.
Are there other examples that you point to?
Oh, very definitely. We see trends towards partnership all over the place. I mean, what is the struggle for our future? It's not between right and left. I mean, you can have oppressive regimes in both, or religious or secular. My God, you can have oppressive regimes in both northern, southern, eastern, western. It's between these two configurations. So when you finally have the Me Too movement, uh, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, which is really about in-group versus out-group thinking, isn't it? I mean, consider that if you have this model of the species where difference, beginning with this difference in form between male and female in our species, is equated with superiority and inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving, you have a template for all in-group versus out-group thinking. It can be Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East. It can be racism in the United States. It can be anti-Semitism. It doesn't matter. There's always a designated other who's inferior and dangerous.
So I'm saying again, so if you think about the opposite, yes, we're seeing movements around Me Too or Black Lives Matter, or thinking about in the United States, certainly systemic racism and things. But if we look around the world, where does it look better? Where is it more encouraging? We have the Nordic countries as an economic model to be thinking about our social model. Are there others you see?
Well, I think that the struggle is really between partnership and domination within every single country on the globe. I mean, when people in Iran are saying, why are we killing homosexuals, throwing them, from mountaintops? I mean, it's a horrible way to die. But well, it's better than being disemboweled or whatever, or having your head chopped off, as in Saudi Arabia. I mean, look, we are seeing the struggle within every single country.
Do you see a shift? I guess what I'm looking for is hope, Riane, in the sense that we can look at all the dark and we can see all the oppressive things. And we certainly saw the rise of ISIS, and it was really frightening. And then somehow it got, hopefully pushed back a bit. But I do think that when I think a lot about the future, and I think as people become, again, more and more frightened, you've heard me talk about this, and make decisions that are very short-term based and are trying to figure out how to get to some level of safety in their world. Where can we point to examples where they will be well held by embracing these a partnership orientation?
Well, but I think that the fact that I sometimes say it as a joke, but it's not really a joke. When I get depressed, I think of the European Middle Ages. Why? Because they looked a lot like the Taliban, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings. Women had absolutely, I mean, theologians seriously argued whether woman, like man, has an immortal soul. I mean, so we have moved, but in fact, every single progressive modern social movement over the 300 years has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. Whether it was the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule, the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children, the so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over an inferior one, all the way to the environmental movement challenging our once hallowed conquest of nature that at our level of technology is suicidal. But we have not paid enough attention to shifting the foundations. Most of the attention has gone to dismantling what I call the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. So I've really focused attention of 4 cornerstones identified by my work and the work of others. Neuroscience shows that childhood, changing our patterns of what children experience and observe in childhood, is foundational. Gender, I've already spoken that this is not just a women's issue, it's a central social and economic issue. Take a look at the gendered system of values, that there's always enough money for prisons, the punitive male head of household, right? or for weapons and wars. Somehow we don't have enough money for caring, you know, health care, child care. Uh, this is crazy, but it's built into the system. Economics, we have to move to what I call a caring economics of partnerism. Retain the solid elements of both the market. We don't happen to have a free market, of course, uh, and of enlightened, caring government policies, but have all policies be guided by, is it going to really uh, care for people starting at birth and care for our natural life support systems? And of course, stories and language. You know, I cannot emphasize that they're all interconnected and that there are many people, to answer your question, today, millions of people are working on these various cornerstones. But, and this is why we've launched the campaign that you are part of, making partnerism mainstream. They've operated as if they were in sort of separate worlds. Uh, we need to understand that this is all part of the shift from domination to partnership. So, yes, we need to do the short term work. I mean, it's insane to fund fossil fuel companies, but we also have to pay a lot of attention to the longer term work
And this is what you're
of
talking about,
the
system.
four cornerstones.
When I interrupted you before, you were talking about we need to think systemically around this, which again, I don't think that we have been raised or trained or
No,
have a lot of experience doing, and then that complexity confuses people and overwhelms people, and so immediately again they regress to something that's simple and try and get to a simple answer and a simple thing, which I do think can be transcendent. What I love about partnerism is that it isn't simple, but it does transcend, and it makes it easier to wrap your arm around something that is systemic, and it gives us a way of being able to talk about it and be able to frame it and be able to invite people more into the conversation. So I do think it doesn't have to be so overwhelming for people to shift the way that they think about it. It really is just new awareness.
it is a change in consciousness, and to understand that there is an alternative, that the only two alternatives are not either you dominate or you're dominated. There is a partnership alternative, and a lot of what's happening in our time, the movements for social and economic justice, the movements against violence, you know, most recently addressing this pandemic of violence globally against women and children, which is just coming to the fore. That's a very important trend, thanks to women's and children's groups, by the way. So, but the thing is, many people, millions of people are working on different aspects of the shift. What we need in order to be more coherent and more effective is to understand that they're part of this systemic shift. And we want to provide people with the resources to really do this. I mean, because so much work is taking place
Well,
already.
so again, we are building out the partnerism.org site, and we'll have more and more of those resources for advocacy. But when you spend time on the Center for Partnership Studies site, it is amazing how many resources you are in there, and it's by role, whether I'm a caregiver or a politician or an activist or just a citizen, or whether I'm interested in particular issues. And you give really great guidance for people on how to take in this information, how to spend more time with it. And again, the part that I was encouraged by, I want to share it with other people, is a voter guide right now. Right? If you really want to advance this work, like this is a really clear place to get engaged with it, which is think about the candidates that are standing up for the issues that we think are so important in order to be able to advance this thinking.
Yes.
So and whether it's that they care about the Family Leave Act or whether they care about quality childcare, to your point, and the funding of that. I forgot what the other pieces that were there, like 4 or 5 issues that were on the voter guide.
Well, I think that really, when we start thinking of the majority of humanity, I mean, that we've been taught to ignore or marginalize the majority of humanity is enough of a wake-up call, I would
Which is
think.
why we started the Femme Future Society. You know, it was really, again, just to recognize that I was just sick of being in presentations over and over again where people talked about inspiring, visionary, futuristic, whatever, and they always just only quoted men. I'm like, there is an extraordinary body of work that women have done that both in the past and currently, and certainly we need to invite more people to do it into the future. And so, yes, I'm a teeny little piece of your, systems change,
You
but
are a very important piece.
well, just because,
Everybody who is working for partnership, and you are very important in two ways, because you not only have for a long time now been doing the work of shifting our thinking and empowering women and all the rest of it, but because you are now also working to make partnerism mainstream. In linguistic psychologists have long told us something we really should pay attention to, that the categories provided by a culture's language, they channel our thinking. So it's almost impossible to see an alternative. So we need new language. And I've not only introduced partnership and domination systems, but a distinction between hierarchies of domination. We all know those, you better obey or there's going to be a lot of pain, even death, or hierarchies of actualization, where power is used to empower rather than disempower, and where accountability, respect, benefit don't just flow from the bottom up, but both ways. So we hear a lot about transparency today. I mean, there are all these trends, and they're all connected with the shift. And once we make that connection, number one, we feel very empowered and we don't feel so overwhelmed. I mean, that's what happened to me. And from all the mail and the feedback I get, that's what happens to readers of my books, to people who are part of the partnerism movement. We can do it. None of us can do everything, but every one of us can do something.
so as we close and we think about, again, we want to give people even more resources and more hope for it. Of the two recent books, I've got Real Wealth of Nations and Nurturing Our Humanity. You advocate people read both. I love the Real Wealth of Nations because it really does help me understand the economic structure of what it is that we're advocating for. And again, opens my eyes about the fact that we don't just have to stick with the stories of the past, but that there's a whole new way of framing it. I have not spent as much time as you know yet with Nurturing Our Humanity, but I've got a lot of history and believe and already supporting that way of thinking, as you and I've talked about my parenting history. So do you, where do people go to sort of launch into this work, Riane? So
Well, you start with wherever it is that, I mean, some people start with sacred pleasure because it really looks at both sexuality and spirituality. And as I said, everything else. Some people go back to chalice,
yeah,
the
I think
chalice and the blade, which
everything
is,
fundamental. Because I think even I didn't fully understand how much you were advocating for gender roles and the piece of it until I really understood how deeply embedded the systemic wiping out of women's power was. It wasn't just sort of a natural thing that kind of evolved here. It was like very concerted effort to ensure that
oh,
women lost it.
absolutely. And that I have two chapters, as you know, in the chalice and the blade called Reality Stood on Its Head. Now it's time for us, and I think of my work that way, as standing reality right side up.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but look, we all, especially those of us who were, quote, educated in universities, because what were we taught? If you look at modern Western science, about 600 years old, it came out of a monastic, celibate, clerical, misogynist culture. The historian of science, David Noble, in his book by the same title, he calls it A World Without Women. And it was also, I would add, a world without children. And it was only 50 years ago, I mean, really, just 50 years ago, that we even began to have women's studies, men's studies, gender studies, queer studies. We have been indoctrinated, especially, as I said, those of us who are, quote, educated in our very siloed, fragmented universities. You talk about systems thinking, that's, forget it.
Well, it gives me hope. Actually, again, as you know, so much of your work does it does give me hope, and I want to be a big advocate for it because I think other people need that too. Need to have a much fresher and more empowering way of framing it. And again, as soon as we mention it to people, people do get excited about it and they're very curious about it. So I would say your books are great resources. Certainly, the Center for Partnership Studies website is an extraordinary resource of all kinds of academic work and framing and empowerment tools that you've done for others. And I think if you just want an introduction to it, to go to partnerism.org and just at least get, steeped in some of the basics of it. It's still a very early version of that site. We're going to continue to build it out over time, and certainly give people more ways in which they can get engaged and they can get tools to advocate. But I do think it's the time is now, and we have no idea what's going to happen on November 3rd in the United States and how that's going to shift things for the next 4 years. But this is a much longer game than that. Right?
Yes.
This is much
a longer game. And if we understand that when Donald Trump says it's all about domination, that's all he knows, poor man. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept that it is not all about domination. Partnerism is more effective economically, certainly in terms of our sustainability, naturally, and in terms of our human yearning for caring connection. Domination systems just don't satisfy that, so people amass all of this stuff,
right,
and never feel satisfied. You asked me what book to start with. I would say that if you're interested in the newest neuroscience and in how it supports this way of looking at society, start with Nurturing Our Humanity. But I would also say that think of reading everything. And I know that reading is not exactly the thing that people do these days, but the way that socialism became a world force is that millions of people, first in small groups, read and discussed and studied some basic writings, brought their own creativity to them. It was the wrong theory, it was a limited theory, but both capitalism and socialism were really attempts to change domination economics.
Right.
But they were so stuck in.
And they changed an aspect of what they were frustrated by, but
right. They couldn't see that if you don't change the foundations, you get another domination system.
So for me, where this intersects so powerfully is because as we do enter more deeply into the 21st century, and we will have the power and the possibility to really shift things, both because technologically we completely redefine our approaches, our ways of solving problems, are things that we know, how we create value, how we exchange value, how we coordinate with others. I mean, all these things are up for complete redesign, and we're only 1% in of what it is that will be possible. The changing our thinking now as we're going to start shaping those systems is so critical. That's why your work is such a pivotal part of what I think we need in order to be able to build this better next that I do believe is really possible. But if we bring that old mindset to this exponential power that we will have moving forward, is, to your point, suicidal. It is so dangerous and scary.
It is really dangerous. And we have to remember that we created, economic systems, social systems, cultural systems, stories, they're human creations.
And they're all going to be redesigned to some degree. I mean, in a pretty significant way. Like, again, the social systems piece of it, even what work looks like and how work is compensated and what we think work looks like.
Absolutely. We are at a place where we really have to redefine what is and is not productive work.
Right.
And that's really fascinating, isn't it?
It is. And it's not because I think that the counter argument to some of this stuff is I would argue that there's no place in history that I would rather go back to that I think had it worked out way better than we did. Maybe, 10,000 years ago, to some of the societies that you and Douglas studied. But for the most part, I would argue there's nothing back in the day that I would rather go to. I do think that we continue to advance society and we use technology and tools to continue to add productivity and quality of life. I just think we keep missing a big chunk of it. And now as our, needs get more met and our consciousness continues to increase and we start to see our worldview broaden, we get to design it differently moving forward, right? We get to think about this even more inclusively and more robustly and productively, and define productivity very differently moving forward. That's to me the phenomenally exciting moment that we're in.
And it is a way to use our creativity instead of having it be sort of channeled
Right.
into, I mean, we're talking about reward systems, both monetary, because money is a neutral, economic invention. The question is, what does it reward or not reward, right? So we have a tremendous opportunity for creativity. But if, as you said, if we stay within the old worldview, at best we have sort of add-ons, and we saw what happens to add-ons with the stroke of a pen. They're
Yeah.
gone.
No, totally. Or we just
Regression.
have an extractive mindset. To your point, this domination mindset, this idea that we win so someone else can lose. We'll have the power to do that in such a aggressive way that I don't think. And I think hopefully that these systems, if they continue down that path, would finally disintegrate on their own. They just sort of topple over in their own. To your point, it's an upside down pyramid, right? So it's not very stable and it wouldn't be able to hold up. But it's a dangerous game to play, and I think it takes too long to get there. So. I appreciate, again, everything that you do, Riane, to help us wake up and to build in stronger and better and smarter and definitely deeply more caring ways. And I'm encouraged every time I hear an executive use the word caring. I'm encouraged when people think about different economic indicators. I'm encouraged when people talk about GDP being outdated and not the right metric for the work we're heading into. So much of the work that you have done has set the tone for that, right? Has been the grounding for that. And I think now we get to go, to your point, bring our creativity and our collaborative thinking to building much stronger, better solutions.
Well, thank you so much, my dear. And I want to invite all of our viewers and listeners. You are really capable of making a huge difference. Use your sphere of influence, whatever it is, so that we can shift and make partnerism mainstream.
I think it's a beautiful way of saying it. Thank you so much. And we will continue doing this work together. I'm so happy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.